What is the general mind of the Shudra mass, which is in the agrarian production, which got cut from the spiritual philosophical domain for 3 to 4,000 years?
Hello and welcome to Gulplok. I am Antara Chakrabarti and today we meet again for another episode of Bookmarked, where we are going to discuss a very recent and rich publication entitled The Shudra Vision for a New Path, edited by Professor Kancha Ilaiah and Karthik Raja Karupasani. Before I go ahead and give an overview of the book, I would like to introduce you all to the stellar panelists that we have with us today. We have philosopher Aakash Singh Rathore, leading philosopher and author of Ambedkar's Preamble, which has come out in 2020. He has taught in several universities like JNU, Delhi University, UPenn, Toronto, and more to say. Also, India's one of the very few Ironman triathletes. He is the editor of the Rethinking India series, a 14-volume book series, and not to mention, today's book of discussion is also a part of this series. We have the second panelist with us, Professor Sanjeev Kumar, HM, Professor of Political Science at the University of Delhi. He has previously taught at universities like South Asian University, University of Allahabad, and Karnataka University. His areas of interest include Islamic thought, international relations, the representation of Muslim identity in Hindi cinema. He is the author of the book entitled Domestic Politics and Foreign Policy, Perspectives on India-Pakistan Relations. Not to mention, but we are indeed very fortunate to have with us the editor of the book, Professor Kancha Ilaiah himself, a name that does not probably require an introduction. Indian political theorist, prolific writer in English and Telugu, and a Dalit rights activist. Author of path-breaking books like Why I Am Not a Hindu, a Shudra critique of Hindutva philosophy, culture, and political economy. God as political philosopher, Buddha's challenge to Brahminism, Buffalo nationalism, a critique of spiritual fascism. He has taught and served in several universities across India as a leading intellectual of our contemporary times. Now, coming to the book, it has been divided across 11 chapters, contributed and crafted on the idea of what constitutes the idea of Shudra in the contemporary scenario. It is a very recent publication in 2021 and has been published by Penguin. So saying so, I don't want to take much time and want to welcome our first panelist, Professor Sanjeev Kumar HM, to take over the platform and tell us about his perusal of the book.
First of all, my dear co-panelist, Aakash, Professor Ilaiah, and members from the Gulplok team. Firstly, again, congratulations to Professor Ilaiah and his colleague for bringing out this very important book in a very difficult times in terms of what we call as the politics of identity and recognition. And this is where I would like to focus my discussion. Firstly, what I actually accept here is the very notion, the category of Shudra, which Professor Ilaiah actually brings in, is quite interesting in the sense that where a very limited casteist definition has been transcended, and the very idea of the politics of recognition and resistance has been attached to that category. So I'm not getting into a postmodern deconstruction, but what I'm trying to do here is the very category, the Shudra, which this book actually encapsulates. Of course, somebody who is a Marxist can come back to us and say that, okay, this looks like a very class kind of a category, but that doesn't, because their historical and cultural categories does not go well with Marxism in that sense. So it is beyond political economy, and the categories of political economics is always, of course, there. And apart from that, the very psychocultural category, which this one word Shudra encapsulate, that actually has captured my imagination in the first instance. So there can be 5 broad interpretations of this category Shudra, which this book actually engages with, say, the political, the cultural, the sociological, the psychocultural, and the economic. And of course, every aspect can be debated. Like, say, for instance, the political category, if I want to begin with, the very idea of what we want to give this word Shudra a new kind of a narrative and meaning, that somewhere down the line has been addressed. But on my part, there is one particular problem which we can discuss. Of course, I agree that somewhere down the line, the politics of identity has not been rigorously and robustly followed. And although there has been a kind of transcendence from what we call as the Hegelian master-slave dialectics, where the whole idea of slave and master accepting this, their own categories, the definition Shudra actually goes beyond that and brings in a new narrative in the sense of political activism and political participation. This whole category, when we go beyond the Hegelian master-slave dialectics, there is a sense of universalization where all the oppressed classes are getting one form of political meaning here, in one word. Like here, the constitutional definition of the SC, ST, OBC, that is, of course, our legal framework. But beyond that, this politico-cultural category has given one particular word which gives an all-inclusive meaning for all the oppressed categories. And that is why I said that it is very, very critical for the politics of recognition as well as resistance. So, like going beyond Partha Chatterjee's Andersonian utopia, and also what he calls as a nation as fragments. Now here, when the nation becomes fragmented, Kancha Ilaiah has also brought this whole idea of buffalo nationalism, and then this whole idea, when we look at that, there is a sense where one particular category can capture different kinds of, you can say competing interests also, like OBCs and the Dalits. There is a competing category, of course, if you look at the UP politics, UP and Bihar politics. For example, as a political scientist, I see culturally there may be a sense of oppression there, but politically they are competitive categories. So this political competition is one important aspect that this book actually picks up. But what this book actually misses is the whole idea of clientelism, the clientelistic politics which the different groups actually engage in, say through the caste associations, where they try to reach a major party. It's not just about the ethnic parties, as what Kanchan says, like Bahujan Samaj Party or Samajwadi Party, but also for last so many decades we had clientelistic politics, which Congress actually nurtured very successfully in North India, and also to considerable extent in South India also. But apart from that, even if you see the trends, even after 2009 parliament elections, gradually the politics of clientelism began to intensify in a different direction. Of course, there the category of dominant caste was getting challenged. So this is one first critique which I would like to bring in. The second one, I am fascinated by the whole idea of the spiritual. Now there are two problems associated for me. Of course, what Ambedkar actually wanted was human rights in a simplest sense. Like everybody has to have the right to worship, space of worship, and also basic rights as human beings, as what a modern democracy, within the framework of Jeffersonian kind of a democracy, what a government can actually give us. Now, when we look at Kancha Ilaiah's book, my problem in the whole idea of the spiritual, where the separate constitution of a separate priest class within the category, now there lies the problem for me. Because again, I would like to go back to Kancha's own book, Why I'm Not a Hindu, in that sense, where borrowing from Bertrand Russell, if I want to say, what Russell was trying to say was to fight against the institutionalized formations of religion. religion, when it is strictly contained to the domain of the private sphere and its institutionalized character, which is very, very dangerous, it is curtailed, then religion performs a very good function. So it has to be a purely Durkheimian kind of a definition where it is purely functionalist. But what happens is religion, of course, Catholicism saw it, and in India also Brahminical hegemony actually also perpetuated this. But that doesn't mean that if there was Brahminical hegemony, institutionalized terror of religion, which is what, again borrowing from Bertrand Russell, institutionalized terror. But why do we want to again create institutionalized fear? For me, people, all of you may or may not agree with me, but the Protestant notion of methodological literalism, which we have to explore, where directly connect, if you want to really speak of the metaphysics of spiritualism, try to connect the individual with the God. Of course, there is no time for theological discussion, but that can be a thought for Professor Ilaiah and his colleagues to think, where, methodological literalism can actually bring in what we call as a significant approach where, you can do the text and you don't need mediators like the pujaris. So without the pujaris, you can actually get to religion. Of course, I can understand the institutionalization drive which is demanded in this term. That is basically a necessity of organization. But for me, the real transition would come, of course, in a very, if you want to put it in a very Gramscian sense, because the idea of hegemony, whenever it is discussed, the problem would come in without, the combination of the economic and cultural structures, which is supported by the political mechanism, then you cannot create hegemony. So obviously, there is a drive where, substantially Constitution provides for where you can create political mechanisms. And of course, economy can also be catered to. But of course, this whole idea of Dalit capitalism, that's a different story, which I'll not dwell into. But what I'm trying to say here is, if you really want to bring in this whole idea of in a non-institutionalized form of counter-hegemony, we don't need to create a class of priests. Rather, the dissemination of the texts more and more, of course, that is being done in the vernacular languages would be, of course, Professor Ilaiah, who else better than this? He has been an ardent proponent of this for so many years. That this whole Sanskrit cosmopolis, which has actually dominated the Indian theological imaginary, that can be negated. Of course, I may be sounding like Plato, that can 120 million everybody pick up the text, 120 crores, sorry, everybody pick up the text and tomorrow say that. Of course, this is Protestant romanticism. But this is what we can ponder over. The final, this whole political economy, where somewhere down the line, economic classes are always, like having their own class interests in a very typical Marxist over-deterministic sense. Politics and, of course, combined in it, like political economy becomes a very significant tool and weapon for resistance and transition. And it has been emphasized by Baba Sahab also eloquently. But what India needs today, which we need to actually ponder, we have to go beyond the spaces of worship, because like the bottom line becomes what, in a very populist sense, the roti kapda makan becomes a very important task. Now, whether, of course, I don't know how to put it, and I throw this open and end my talk. The roti versus faith. Now there lies the question. Of course, faith becomes a higher necessity. So when you have roti, the faith becomes a higher necessity. But if you don't have roti, can you pursue faith? What will happen if you create a class of priests? Again, are we not again getting to Russell's notion of institutionalized fear, the tool of fear which Bertrand Russell was trying to tell us? Rather, should we not strive for creating spaces for having rotis and dignified living, food, shelter, and other.
Thank you so much, Professor Sanjeev Kumar. I think Professor Kumar has opened the platform with really intriguing and thought-provoking pointers. So without wasting much time, I would like to welcome our next panelist, Professor Aakash Singh Rathore, to take over.
Thank you very much. So it's a great pleasure to be here with one of India's most important leading public intellectuals, Kancha Ilaiah, Shephard, and also the other people on the panel. So I'm quite intimately familiar with this book. I read it while it was in the process of being drafted. And so instead of talking about my own reflections about the book and its significance, which I cannot overestimate, this is an extremely significant work, I want to talk about one very narrow aspect. And this comes up on page 59 on the PDF, and it's a quotation from Professor Kancha's own. If Shudras do not change, Dalit lives will not change either. So this is a very intriguing idea, and obviously it invites the Dalit readership as well to stand up and pay attention to what is happening in this work, primarily focused on the Shudra. So I want to discuss this Shudra-Dalit relationship basically under three themes. One is atrocity, the second is unity, and the third, as Professor Kumar already mentioned, spirituality. So on the first point, atrocity. The book is not at all silent about the material fact that Shudras are responsible for a great deal of atrocity against Dalits, especially in the agrarian rural. On page 19, there's a passage. Dalit intellectuals are often seen to shoulder the task of Bahujan unity while dealing with atrocities against Dalits by Shudras, OBCs. And I think that was from the editor's own introduction. And then later from another chapter, page 143, it's stated, and I quote, Shudras are now the greatest oppressors of Dalits. The practice of untouchability against Dalits by Shudras is well documented. Basically, it's an undeniable fact, and no one is interested in denying the fact that they're in the agrarian realm, the tensions, the animosity, and the real material confrontation between Shudras and Dalits is an undeniable phenomenon. Now, the causes behind that phenomenon, we can identify at least three different. One, theological, let's say, that the Shudras largely remain Hindus and not your average kind of Hindu, but in fact, as the book makes a very strong point of mentioning, precisely the muscle power of the emerging, since the last 30 years, muscularized, saffronized Hindutva type Hinduism that we have been witnessing over the last decades. And then materially, as I had mentioned, in the agrarian economy, the Dwijas have largely abandoned this space, leaving only Shudras and Dalits to fight out for increasingly dwindling resources and, of course, age-old tensions about land ownership and so on. So basically, the material agrarian conditions pit Dalit against Shudra in a manner that is seemingly unavoidable in the current economy. And then the third, if the first is theological, the second is material and economic, the third is obviously ideological, which is, in short, what we could call Brahmanism and its system of graded inequality, which in some way makes it inevitable that Shudras as Savarnas would clash with Dalits as the next rung down in the Brahminical order for the Shudras to exploit and take advantage. So you have these conditions. In some respects, we can see that at least two out of these three conditions seem beyond the control of Shudras themselves, and yet play as a significant part in this fact of atrocity. Now, part of the solution to this atrocity is mentioned in the book, and I quote this idea, raising Shudra consciousness, of course, as a happy byproduct, the consciousness of others. As I mentioned, I've learned an enormous amount from this work. The word consciousness is mentioned 36 times in the book and across at least 5 different chapters. So it's a very central idea to the work. And I'm going to read from page 161. Only a new Shudra consciousness can save India. A reformed Shudra consciousness should be able to offer equality to Dalits on the one hand and demand the same from the Dwija castes. So what we see here is that, at least in terms of atrocity, part of the solution is the raising of Shudra consciousness, which would allow then the Shudras to offer equality as opposed to submitting to the system of graded inequality and Brahmanism, and at the same time to demand equality from the Dwijas, who within that very same system of Brahmanism put Shudras as near the bottom as possible. Is the solution of the raising of consciousness equal to the task of this sort of atrocity and violence? And that takes me to the second point on unity. Now, the same quotation that I'd read from page 19, that Dalit intellectuals are often seen to shoulder the task of Bahujan unity. This passage mentions the word unity, I think, 3 times in it. So the idea of Bahujan was a concept created precisely for or towards unity. So it's often pointed out that Kanchiram had coined this term Bahujan in an effort to unify Shudra and Dalit, and of course possibly also STs and maybe Pasmanda Muslims and others from marginalized communities. But basically here I'm talking about Shudras and Dalits. And what this served to do by uniting Shudras and Dalits and possibly also STs and others was creating an electoral bloc, an absolute powerhouse when you can compare Dwijas with all of these communities of marginalized. You have, in terms of demographics, no competition at all. So the unity is not only justified from an ethical and historical position, but it's even politically pragmatic. And this term Bahujan, as used in Bahujan Samaj Party, represents or signifies that unity. Now, what I'd like to ask Professor Kancha, because you have been accused of dismantling this unity by creating the term Dalit Bahujan. So this compound term, Dalit Bahujan, would seem then to use the concept of Dalit to ascribe the group of former untouchables Dalits, and then reserve the concept Bahujan for Shudras. And so by creating then this compound expression Dalit Bahujan, you have been accused of undermining, in some respect, Kanchiram's efforts towards unity through coining a term Bahujan, which takes care, or which is an umbrella term for Dalits and Shudras. After atrocity and unity, I'm going to talk about spirituality. So this idea of spiritual slavery and spiritual liberation runs throughout the book, just as much as Shudra consciousness does. On page 52, I'm going to read a bit from the passage runs. We can clearly see that the freedom of OBCs from the social and spiritual slavery of Brahmanism requires religious reform, even as far as conversion. They all rejected the Vedas, temples, Hindu idols, the caste system, and Brahminical scriptures. One of the foremost contemporary scholars of the spiritual slavery of Shudras, Kancha Ilaiah Shephard, says, quote, in my view, unless the battle is won in the spiritual realm, as well as in the day-to-day processes, OBCs cannot succeed. And again, Shephard says, what the Hindutva, Brahminic forces are afraid of is that the Dalits have a definite agenda of their spiritual liberation, most of them embracing either Buddhism or Christianity. And if the OBCs too, who are the main source of the muscle power, work out a spiritual liberation agenda, Brahmanism and Hinduism will collapse like a house of cards. As a very significant set of ideas that are being attributed to Professor Kancha here, and I think we've all read them ourselves in Why I Am Not a Hindu. We get this sense, the same sense of dismantling Brahmanism, but primarily through the mechanism, it seems, of conversion. Now, in this new book, the Shudras, it doesn't seem so much that the mechanism is conversion. It seems, on the contrary, that it is some sort of reform. And so this is the question that I want to raise about spiritual slavery and spiritual liberation. Is spiritual liberation, and this is a topic that is obviously very important to Ambedkarite Dalits, to be found in conversion, as Ambedkar had suggested? Or is there some possibility of reform that Professor Kancha is now introducing? Now, I do want to point out that there are some very impactful language that Kancha-ji uses in his own essay. On page 66, he writes, "Unless Shudras get spiritual power and emerge as a spiritual force, taking over every role, including Hindu priesthood, they will slip into the classical Hindu Varna-based position." Now, why I say this is very powerful is because you get this sense that the Shudras must control the spiritual means of production. By completely monopolizing the spiritual realm, the institutions which Professor Sanjeev Kumar was talking about, what we get is a kind of, let's say, Marxist analogy of taking over the means of production, taking over the spiritual means of social production. In that sense, to call what Professor Kancha is doing as merely reform would seem weak, because this is actually revolution. Nevertheless, we do generally think of the distinction as conversion versus reform. And so the question is, has Professor Kancha changed more to a reformist rather a reformist attitude? Now, part of the whole impetus of this book, what makes it so brilliant and important, is that it is offering a vision for a new path for a kind of internal unity of the Shudras as such, in addition to leaving the possibility for an external unity, Bahujan unity, let's say, of Shudras, Dalits, and the marginalized in more general terms. Now, that requires first and foremost a coherence between a very divided Shudra or set of Shudra castes and communities. One of the major divisions is, of course, between so-called upper Shudras, Jats, Gujars, Patels, Marathas, Nayars, Reddis, and so on, and then the lower Shudras who work in the agrarian sectors, another powerhouse of production, agricultural production in India. So what Professor Kancha seems to want to do is to create some sort of unity of consciousness between the upper Shudras with their economic and political power, leveraging that together with the lower Shudras with their demographic as well as productive power, and creating unified Shudra, which would be, once again, not only ethically justified, but pragmatically and politically extremely effective. Now, the Shudras, however, just the castes that I mentioned, it's clear, are internally very divided, not to mention what I was speaking of in the beginning about Bahujan unity, already very tenuous. And so the idea seems to be that by alerting all Shudras, upper and lower, to the ideological conditions, or rather the spiritual conditions which they in fact find themselves in, spiritual slavery, irrespective of their political power, irrespective of their economic might, within Brahmanism, Shudras, upper as well as lower, are spiritual slaves. They are disqualified theologically, they are disqualified ritually, and as much as they would like to comfort themselves by lording it over those below them within the Brahminical hierarchy, they must recognize that within the system itself, they are a subject. And so by pointing out very plainly that all of the Shudras within the current ideological and spiritual regime are a subject people, are spiritual slaves, this awareness, this consciousness can lead to a kind of mobilization and unity of the spiritually oppressed, and a march then towards their liberation. So with these 3 points, sort of questions to Professor Kancha, I leave off my comments, but I just do want to end emphatically that this book is a kind of landmark achievement that I think everybody has to read, because I can't claim my own consciousness has been elevated. I'm still an imbecile, but it makes a major impact on the way that one views the sort of political possibilities for our collective future. So thank you very much, Kancha-ji and Karthik, for this wonderful work.
Thank you so much, Professor Aakash. And I think Professor Aakash has also raised some really crucial points. And now, without wasting much time, I think we are all getting impatient to listen to Professor Kancha. So over to you, sir.
Very good discussion on the book. This is the book that we are discussing. It is part of the Rethinking India series, which Professor Aakash Singh Rathore and other Samruddha Bharat friends are working on, part of 14 volumes. And I really thank both Sanjeev Kumar and Aakash for reviewing the book with their own ideological understanding of the book. Now, I would quickly take up what Sanjeev Kumar has been trying to argue about, the very ontological question of the book, whether the issue of religion should be debated the way this book tries to debate, or is there a way of resolving the socio-spiritual political questions of India, the way the European rationalism has seen in the context of Bertrand Russell and so on. Professor Aakash Singh Rathore, who himself is a very well-known philosopher, who has done major work on Hegel, and he posed very serious questions in the context of a lot of Dalit scholars are reviewing the book in a very positive but in a very critical way, engaging with the concepts that the whole Dalit movement has thrown up, from Ambedkar to Kanshira, and what I have been writing right from Why I'm Not a Hindu to present. And but this is a teamwork. Without BJP RSS being in power the way it is in power, writing of this book would have been impossible. And it would have also been impossible without locating it in the Ambedkarite background, based on what he wrote as who were the Shudras. And in fact, a number of Dalit scholars are saying this whole question of race is not important today. But Ambedkar himself in that book consistently calls India Indo-Aryan society. And though he does not accept the Aryan migration, but now the latest literature, particularly Tony Joseph book, Early Indians, has really conclusively proved that migrations took place, Aryan migration was there, and India has several races in a very mixed form. So the Dalit scholarship has to relook at some of the concept that Ambedkar said. Now, Sanjeev Kumar also raises this point, this whole idea of Shudra. Just went back to Ambedkar's book. He also, raises in the introduction the same question. I'm trying to write a book on Shudra people will ask whether it is important to write a book on Shudras, because there was no book before that on that category. Though in entire Hindu literature, the Shudra category as fourth Varna has been there, but there was no separate book, and he really doubts his own scholarship level and reviews Western scholars, but finally comes that there are Shudras now, and there was a Shudra category, and they were subjected mainly from the religion point. I think Professor Sanjeev Kumar has to view this. Ambedkar says Shudras were part of the Kshatriyas, they were rulers. While being rulers, they tyrannized the Brahmins, and the Brahmins, because they suffered the Shudra ruling tyranny, they refused to give them sacred bread. Therefore, they fell back into the fourth Varna. Now, this is a very interesting spiritual conclusion about majority getting thrown into slavery as fourth Varna, even assuming that they were rulers. Though Rigveda does not provide that evidence for it. Now, that means the Hindu religion as RSS BJP is presenting today is not like Christianity or Islam or even like Buddhism. Shudra mass need to engage with religion, whether, and as Aakash rightly posed, that a lot of Dalit scholars are also asking that should they look for an alternative like Ambedkar, or am I also not asking for alternative as I did in Why I'm Not a Hindu raised that. So these questions, as scholars today we ask, what is the general mind of the Shudra mass which is in the agrarian production, which got cut from the spiritual philosophical domain for 3,000 to 4,000 years. Now, this is not Christian experience. This is not European experience. The church-going Christian population today in England is just 8 to 9 lakhs. And there is a new religion now called liberals, seculars, and Harari goes on to say that there is the old understanding of religion has changed now. Even Marxism is a religion, he said. Now, given this question, having been organized by RSS BJP to attack Muslims, all the major Shudras, what should they do now? Now, this question was not before Ambedkar. This question was also not before Kanshira. Even when I wrote Why I'm Not a Hindu, I did not presume that BJP RSS would come to power in this form, would drive the whole productive mass, both of reserved OBC category and the non-reserved Shudras, into their own fold in order to systematically push back into the slavery of the medieval kind. Because they are not there in intellectual domains, in central universities. These very same people say that reservation is anti-merit. But there are Shudras who are not in reservation, yet they don't figure in Delhi University, they don't figure in JNU, they don't figure in IITs, IIM, and they don't figure in spiritual priesthood, not just for few years. They were denied it right from the beginning of formulation of religion through oral forms and also through textual form. So Bertrand Russell wanted to be in India with a caste system. He would have asked them to fight for a right to priesthood more violently than what I am asking, but not to go out of religion because they have their own religious practices, but which are not national systems. They have their own gods, and Ram Shephard's essay categorically talks about from Harappan days to now. As RSS BJP has organized them into one so-called majoritarian group against the Muslims, without giving the right to spiritual democratic equality, then ask them to fight for that within. Then there will be an internal battle. The internal battle you can already see after Narendra Modi laid the earth-breaking stone to Ram temple. Brahmins are saying, how can he do this? He is not a Brahmin. They would not have any problem if it were Jawaharlal Nehru, though he was atheist. So here is a declared OBC, maybe a Banya or non-Shudra OBC. Brahmins are not accepted. That is the reason why today Jats, Gujas, Patel, Reddy, Kama, all of them put together are not equal to Banya. Leave alone not equal to Shankaracharyas there. So how do you explain the present 52% people always remaining 52 more or less, not fighting for the priesthood right ever in history? Any Shudra intellectual has to pose a question like Ambedkar in 1946. 1946, he too asked for reform of Hinduism as a born untouchable, that he wants reform and fought with Gandhi. And finally, he ended up in 56 saying, reform is not taking place, therefore I am going out. And Dalits, intellectual Dalits are more on that road now. You will see the day Shudras, Kammas or Reddys or Kapus of Telugu states ask for Tirupati priest temple, the battle will be much more than the Babri Masjid Ram temple. You never imagined what will the Brahmin forces will say the day when they raise this question. So given this, we thought of first broadly conceptual level, intellectual consciousness level, as Aakash rightly posed the question. First, generate an intellectual discourse among reserved Shudras and non-reserved Shudras that they should own up the category of Shudra person, which is a given up category. And OBCs hang around the constitutional category, which cannot be theorized. It cannot be theorized like Protestant, Catholic, or Jew. It cannot be theorized. Therefore, first raise a question among them and create a downward movement from there. Here I strongly believe the Marxist methodology. You have to work among intellectuals and create downward movements. Go down into the layers because now schools and colleges are accessible. Now, how do we understand the concepts? When I was writing Why I'm Not a Hindu, Dalit was different, Dalit Panthers movement, and even in Andhra Pradesh, Dalit Mahasabha, and Kanshiram at the same time was using Bahujan without defining who that Bahujan means. Bahujan, the concept is a number concept, majority. He did not define, but internally when I discussed with him, we addressed seminars together. He said, all Shudras, including Jats, Gujars, Dalits, Adivasis and minorities. That was his hope of getting majority vote. But that Bahujan did not work. When Mayavati came to power for 5 years as with majority of her own, she constituted a Bahujan with Dalits and Brahmins. The idea of majority is shifted to Brahmins there. Because in UP, 12% Brahmins are. So what does this mean? How does Kanshiram Bahujan concept work? Then what I did was, theoretically, Dalit and Bahujan must be united in the Buddhist sense, then gave a definition in Why I'm Not a Hindu, suppressed, oppressed and exploited majority, in which the Dwijas do not count. Otherwise, today Kanshiram's Bahujan concept has no meaning. And in the publication market, Dalit is popular. Even Penguin has gone into Dalit publications in a big way. So where is Bahujan then? And when we are using Shudra, it is a catchable, theorizable, historically parallel concept with the Dalit and with an idea. I think Aakash is right. What is our direction? If we are hanging on to Ambedkarism as they themselves are saying, I know what Ambedkarism is, all my life I worked around them. How do we take Indian society to the process of annihilation without Shudras realizing this caste system is against our own ultimate equality, both in this world and in the believing Swarga, Can they annihilate caste? Can only 18.5% Dalits annihilate caste? No. They can only abolish untouchability. So if Shudras become conscious of their Shudraness, their production and exploitation and control by non-productive people, and the Dalits become conscious of their Dalitness, then they will have to together fight for annihilation of caste. Otherwise, it is not possible. That is what RSS successfully used ever since the whole idea of Dalit Bahujan came. Though UP Dalits ruled, but the Dalit social status, Dalit educational status, Dalit equality in the villages, on many counts, is far better than in UP in all South Indian states. So ultimately, the God that we are all worshipping is equality. My God is equality. So I will worship, I am not an atheist, but my God is equality. How do we reach that God is a long-term issue, even in my own life, in anybody's life and society's life. So I'll stop here. Maybe you can reflect back on what I said and what you felt.
Invite the panelists again if you people have to add some one-liners after listening to Professor Ilaiah.
Well, I think whatever Professor Ilaiah said, of course, one suggestion, he said that to go alternative and create a new religion. But of course, again, my only problem was to just say that I fear institutionalized forms of religion. So my thoughts completely come from that. The followers of Basaveshwaras have created a new form of neo-Brahminical kind of hegemony. So these are some of the problems which we encounter. So especially looking at that, one example, Basaveshwara was a great social reformer, but look what his followers are doing. Because I lived in North Karnataka, which is predominantly dominated. Of course, Karnataka politics is also dominated by that. So I was worried, and I get terrorized with this new Brahminical reincarnation of that. Now they are also demanding for a new faith. So anyway, thank you.
We move on to Professor Aakash, if you would like to add some one-liners.
And I think Professor Kancha, in your talk, which was in some ways mesmerizing, I can always listen to you without end, I feel. You touched on each of these issues that I had raised, atrocity, unity, and spirituality, and I think you more or less perfectly answered or addressed these tensions. And it's fascinating that these tensions exist, and I think they will continue to exist until the historical process itself plays out. And that it's a much, Andra said one-liner, and I'm already on my fifth line, but it's a very significant philosophical point that was raised not only by Ambedkar, but also by as diverse a group of people as Marx and even Nietzsche, for all his strange racist philosophizing. Each, Hannah Arendt, just a very diverse historical group of philosophers have been very particular about the way that an elevation of consciousness turns out to be a precondition for material change. And this is ironic that even Marx himself would raise such a point, given that dialectical materialism assumes the precise opposite, that it is material conditions that pave the way for changes in consciousness. And yet Marx's silence about the nature of the communist state already indicates that there's no point speaking about something that our consciousness simply cannot grasp. So an elevation of consciousness was a precondition for even beginning to foresee what sort of political changes are possible.
Yeah, I thank Professor Kancha and all the discussions. It's very happy to hear it getting discussed. We feel that is the most important point to start the discussion because there have been very few works on Shudras in a long Indian academic journey. There has been very few books that address this large portion of humanity, like almost 10% of the population of the whole world. So also this is an exciting opportunity provided by Professor Kancha and Penguin to work on this project which made it possible for a lot of young scholars and experienced politicians, journalists, all come together, professors, it's a very great experience to work and form an intellectual community. And so many of the points we have raised, they are very contentious issues, like say for release, for example, religion, what is the resolution of the religion question. So Professor Kancha is very categorical in insisting that to the young scholars, religion is a very important domain on which we need to concentrate. To communicate to the masses, to engage with the masses, we need to talk in which they are engaging most with. Because the lot of the traditions of left and liberal kind of scholarships in the Indian liberal institutes, elite institutes they have the conversation in terms of secularism and communalism, but that's a very limited strand of what religiosity stands for or what kind of hold it has on the people's mind. For example, like I was amazed when Professor Kancha wrote one article about like caste in heaven. He was explaining about like how he was asking how the if the Brahminical indictments are so strong in earth, how a Brahmin will allow you to enter the heaven. Uh, so for some, this idea might sound how what all this, what meaning this have. But we are might be in the very few minority. For a lot of people, they spend a lot of their time and money in rituals to make their parents and grandfathers go to heaven. So this is the kind of a creative mind I see in him, which questions and at the same time engages with the actual social realities. He is able to take on realities at by its own ground. So similarly, I see this question like conversion or capturing the spiritual authorities. I feel like even like Professor Kancha suggests that to Shudras, the question is whether they are able to get the spiritual citizenship from the otherwise fascist religion already. And that question is interesting because this is posed to a lot of Shudras who believe they are, part of the Brahminical hegemony, and but which is not the case. And there are other streams. For personally, I feel there are also other streams which are emphasized by Professor Kancha in his previous stream, which is more interesting, which is I'm exploring. Like he suggests that actually, like in Andhra, and also it's true in Tamil Nadu, that the intermediary caste, various intermediate caste have their traditional deities. So, but they know from their generations and relatives that this is the kind of religious or spiritual root they have. I feel like this volume, when it comes to religion, or Professor Kancha Ilaiah in general, when I see his reading, it's about devising a smart approach or a strategy to break this stranglehold, because we have to be always re-strategize, because in the history a lot of efforts like against Brahmanism, like Buddhism or Bhakti movement or even Satya Shodak movement, all have been somehow diluted, disarmed, and some assimilated when we see the history. So it becomes extremely important to recalibrate and fight this battle of equality and gain egalitarianism in a much dynamic way.
Thank you so much, Karthik, for joining in. I would like to request Professor Kancha to give us some concluding remarks after listening to all the other speakers.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful session. And I think after this book came, all kinds of discussions are happening. And this conversation on this forum is very important. In the near future, India is going to definitely have a path that would certainly liberate people who have been enslaved in various forms. Various new paths will be opened once the Shudras realize, whether it's Jat, Gujar, Patel, who are around Delhi, or the Shudras who are regionally located in each state in South, once they realize that they need to now capture politically, spiritually, intellectually, then a new visa is opened for Indian democracy. So I think all of us are interested in protecting the Constitution, saving Indian democracy from the forces that are systematically, we put it in the introduction that I wish Aakash would have been here, that he said Hindu Rashtra is not possible, nor they are thinking about it. I feel that I wrote a review of his book that no, they are seriously thinking, one section of RSS BJP at least, that Hindu Rashtra should be the reality. But the conversations like this, writings like this, and expansion of this discourse will definitely checkmate it, and Indian democracy will be protected and saved. Thank you very much. Even this small effort is in that direction. Thank you so much.
I thank the panelists for joining us today, along with the editors, and thank you so much for such a rich conversation. And we really look forward to reading the book, especially the people who have joined us today. I think should definitely give a read to the book, and it would be really nice if everybody could go through it. So again, thank you so much, and it was a pleasure to host you all on Gulplok.